Hello, and welcome to today's program. My name is Dave Arnott. I'm a professor at Dallas Baptist University. I've been cruising many years, and I thought maybe a contribution to our cruising compatriots would be sort of a port lecture that has to do with some subjects about the countries we're about to visit. So this is a sample that we might do for you in terms of the history, culture, political system, religion, and economy of some of the countries we're going to visit. Now, this will be rather quick today. It can be extended if we need to do that. So here we go. South America, history, culture, political system, religion, and economy of Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, the three countries we will visit on this tour. I've left off Uruguay for reasons I'll explain later. Okay? And my name is Dave Arnott. Here we go. I'm a professor at Dallas Baptist University, so you're in one of my classrooms with me today. JC's running the camera for us. Thank you, JC. Here's me. I have 3 kids and 5 grandkids. My wife, Ginger, and I love cruising, so we are Ginger and the Professor. For those of you who remember Gilligan's Island, we really are Ginger and the Professor. So as you see us around the ship on deck, you greet us as Ginger and the Professor because we are. Thanks for being with us today. Here's the overview of Brazil. So let's do the country in countries in the orders in which we're going to visit them on this trip. So here's Brazil, very quickly, a little about the history, cultural, political system, religion, economy. I'm not going to do the metaphor today because we don't have time for that. That's another subject which is very interesting, by the way. So what I want you to do is be prepared so that when you get off the ship, you know the country that you're going into. So here we go. Here's a little about the history of Brazil. There are 6 major people groups, and that's what really sets this country apart from Argentina and Chile. Argentina and Chile are very homogeneous. They're one people group. Brazil has 6. This is a very interesting country. They are the Portuguese, and of course they speak the Portuguese language. And the Portuguese colonized Brazil in the 16th century. Africans brought to Brazil as slaves. Now that's really what makes the country different. Argentina and Chile did not have a slave trade. So they do not have this influx or this influence from West Africa that Brazil does. And that's what makes the Brazilian culture so rich and so interesting compared to the other countries we're going to visit. Other Europeans, many Germans, and of course that happened after World War I and after World War II, many of the Germans escaped Europe and came to Brazil where they were welcomed and set up businesses, and they're still there. Middle Eastern immigrants came. Japanese, here's a little trivia for you. Largest Japanese population outside the country of Japan, right there, Brazil. Second largest Japanese population in the world is in Brazil. Indigenous, which are the Tupi and the Guarani. There are many other indigenous groups I don't have time to talk about today. I do happen to like this one because it gives a name to one of my favorite soft drinks in Brazil, Guaraná. It's a wonderful thing. If you can ever get some Guaraná when you're in Brazil, it's great, great stuff. Sort of a mix between Sprite and orange juice, I guess. It's just great stuff. I can't explain it. Man, is it good. From 1875 to 1960, about 5 million Europeans immigrated to Brazil. Again, as I mentioned, this is in the post-war era after World War I and World War II. And so you get this really interesting mix of people in Brazil that you have in no other country in the world. That's why I love Brazil. Matter of fact, when people ask me, what's your favorite country to go to? Brazil is usually my answer, and for a number of interesting reasons. They have diversity and inclusion. Again, those of us from America, we realized that we had the slave trade in America, and this produced the black population we have in the United States, now going by the term African American. We were not the only ones. You know, of all the slaves that were brought from West Africa to the New World in the 1800s, 5% landed in the U.S. 5%. Where the other 95% land? A lot of them in Brazil. They, however, their culture is different than ours. They had diversity and inclusion much before we did in the U.S. In the U.S., intermarriage is now very acceptable. It hasn't been for years. In Brazil, it's always been acceptable. And so you have this more interesting mixing of races in Brazil than you'll see in the United States and probably from the country you're from also. All right, the population of Brazil is 202 million. 5th largest country in the world. China, India, the U.S., Indonesia, Brazil. 5th largest population in the world. There you go. Now the culture. Oh, okay. This comes from a guy who's one of my gurus. His name is Geert Hofstede. He teaches at the University of Limburg in Maastricht in the Netherlands. He worked for IBM in the 1970s. and had an opportunity that nobody previous to that had had. We've always asked this question, what's the difference between the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Germans, and the Americans? Well, of course, there is a difference, and those of you who have traveled know there is. Hofstede was one of the first people to put that into numbers and to say for us, you want to know the difference? Here it is. And he came up with 4 indices, or progressions across an index, if you want to look at it that way. And this is the difference. Now, I've used these in some studies I've done, and there are many people like Hofstede who have done this. I tend to like Hofstede's the best. I think he has the best formula for telling us what's the difference. And the reason I want to explain this to you, I want you to be prepared for when you get off the ship in Brazil, when you get off the ship in Argentina, how are these people different from the culture from which I come? Okay? Hofstede originally came up with 4. A 5th was added later. The 5th measure is for Brazil, but it does not exist for Argentina and Chile. So for Brazil, we're going to look at 5 differences between an outside culture and the Brazilian culture. For Argentina and Chile, only 4. Here's the first one. It's called power distance. So across this spectrum, each of the cultures that Hofstede measures, and he has 72 in his study, he said one of the differences between your culture and theirs is probably power distance. Now, low power distance means, what do you call your boss? Well, in the U.S., we usually call our boss by his or her first name. In higher power distance countries, you would call your boss sir or ma'am. Got it? What's the difference? Here's America, and when I say American culture for the rest of our time together here, American culture, Canadian culture, British culture, Australian culture, essentially exactly the same. If we look it up on the internet and I'd show you the numbers, you'd be astounded at how close the cultures are. They're almost exactly the same. So those of you with me today from any of those countries, they all have the same culture. But I've got the American flag up here to show you that the power distance there is 40. Well, that doesn't mean anything to you until you see a relative, is it? Here's the relative. I put Japan up here because I wanted an Asian culture to show you the difference, and quite a few Japanese sail with us. So if you're in a Japanese culture, obviously you're going to have a higher power distance than you'd have in an American culture. But you're not going to the US or Japan. You're going to Brazil. What do you think comes out? Here's the answer. They have even a higher power distance than Japan, which frankly is kind of surprising to me, because I would think the Japanese would have a very high power distance. But look at this. The Brazilian culture has even a higher power distance between people and society than does Japan. Probably comes from Catholicism, could come from the old days when there were slaves and masters. I don't know where it comes from, but this really is one of the most interesting numbers we're going to see in our diagram today. Well, the second one Hofstede said is collective and individual. Well, American culture are the champions of individuality, for good or ill. We are the most individual country in the world, and you Brits and Canadians and Australians, you're not far behind. You're down there on that end with us. You can pretty much guess that Japan is going to be to the left of us. Wouldn't you guess? Sure, they are more collective. Matter of fact, every country in the world is more collective than America. We are the most individual culture in the world. But you're not going to either of those countries. You're going to Brazil. And so now you're thinking with me. You know Brazil is going to be to the left. It's just a question of how far. And there they are. They're even more collective than the Japanese. This is pretty astounding. So in these cultures, we think very much about the individual. In these cultures, they think very much about the collective or the group. Okay, so when you see a favela in Rio de Janeiro, people are living together in a collective society relative to other places. That's a collective, yep. Oh, as a matter of fact, I was at a football game in Brazil, and it started to rain. And there was a guy selling rain punches. So I go down there and I got my currency out there. And this guy's standing and waiting also. And he can see this other, fan, this other spectator. He can see that if he takes my money and puts it together with his money, that'll save from making change, and he can just give me his money back, and he'll do the transaction for me. So I'm standing there with my dollar, my raiz, by the way, in my hand. He grabs it out of my hand, puts it with his, gives me his back, and buys the ponchos and gives me my money back. Don't do that in individual society. But in Brazil, it's fine. The idea is we're all here together. We're all watching the soccer game, football, excuse me, and we're all enjoying each other. Let's be a collective. There's many other stories I could tell you, but I don't have time today. Here's the third one that Hofstede helps us understand. Feminine and masculine. Now, okay, we're in a classroom, and I'm sorry to sound professor-like for you, but we got to understand this. Sex is physical, male and female. Gender is psychological. You see the world as masculine or feminine. And there's actually an assessment you can do that will measure whether you see the world as masculine or feminine. Guys are scared to take it because they think they're going to come out feminine, but it's okay. So really it has to do with masculine worldview is a lot of winners and losers. Feminine worldview is we all come out the same. Pretty much guessed that America is going to be there somewhere. The Japanese are going to be way over on the right end. They may be the most masculine society in the world. Look at those guys. Winning and losing is really important in Japan. Now you're thinking about Brazil. You know it's going to be down here in the middle somewhere, don't you? Actually, it's to the left of America. They have a more feminine society than the US or the Japanese. So they tend to think more in terms of an equal outcome. Now, Hofstede, the guy who wrote this, wouldn't like this, but he's not here today, and I am. The more I look at this, this seems to me like capitalism and socialism. And the Brazilians are a little more socialist than America is.